Welcome to Critical Thinking Skills in Science. We're in Chapter 10, Critical Thinking itself, or thinking critically about critical thinking. This is session number 5. We're wrapping up. We have the house diagram, and just want to emphasize the importance of each part of the house and how it affects how we think, how it affects what we practice. So what we're talking about is culture, and culture on the bottom is part of the Weltbild of the German concept, is all the influences that we cultivate. And a lot of times we get very passive in being cultivated into a certain way of thinking. When cultivate, comes from a verb that has to do with farming, and culture, and it has to do with a very intentional hard work method of producing something. And it's the same way in our own lives, in that if we are going to produce something that is worth it, we need to invest, and we need to focus, and we have to be intentional about cultivating certain dispositions, attributes, and abilities. And not just accepting and saying, well, that's what I was taught, or that's what happened, or that. It's kind of like we are. I guess this is Western. We're responsible, and we can choose how we're cultivated, and we can choose to maintain that cultivation, or we can choose to be recultivated in a different way. So we have culture, which is a very, very important part of the process of thinking. And then we have our epistemology, which is our source of reliable knowledge. And again, my personal source of reliable knowledge is outside of authority, is choosing to follow the authority of the God of the Bible, who says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men freely. And so my choice of source of reliable knowledge is an external authority. It's through God's Word. It's through God's Spirit that teaches us and leads us. But if we're having to do critical thinking the Western style, then that demands the source of reliable knowledge as human reason, and it discards the other sources as unreliable sources. So once we pick a reliable source, what we're saying is that the other sources are not reliable for whatever reason. After we pick our reliable source of knowledge, then we get our basic beliefs, then we develop a system of thought, our philosophy, then we have our methods of what we apply and how do we get to reliable knowledge. And those methods for me are all included, directed by the power of the Holy Spirit, directed by the Spirit of truth. Whereas in critical thinking, it is all human-based, it is all reason-based, and it's independently based, autonomously based, self-directed, self-critical, self-governing. And so it's kind of like, I don't agree with those methods. My methods are different. The resources that we have for working with, and then we have our conclusions. And that goes along with Stephen Jay Gould's 4 factors of culture, prejudice, theory, and habit, and what we're practicing. And so just giving you an overview now of how critical thinking, and we assume that, yes, critical thinking is good and everyone should do it, but at the same time, it's defined in different ways by different cultures and even by different disciplines within a single culture. So this is the importance of putting together our own house structure, and can we accept critical thinking as required by a Western mindset? Are you willing to build a house that incorporates that and assumes those values? That is why the homework or the different projects are of developing our own basis of thought, and what can we do and what can't we do, and what are the limitations, what are our basic beliefs. Going back to critical thinking and type 1 and type 2 thinking, are two different ways the brain processes information. Type 1 is fast, automatic, and intuitive, while type 2 is slower, more deliberate, and conscious. Here's again the rundown of the type 1 processing, which they say is intuitive. It's fast, high capacity, parallel, contextualize, automatic, associative, experience-based decision making. The type 2 processes are analytical, slow, capacity is limited, it's serial, one after another. It is conscious, abstract, controlled, rule-based, consequential decision making. Now, why did I go over those again? Well, because I have some articles here that I just want you to be able to see what are some of the comments about the System 1, System 2 thinking. In 2011, researchers from Harvard University published a paper showing that people who have a tendency to rely on their intuition, which is System 1, Type 1 processing, are more likely to believe in God. They also showed that encouraging people to think intuitively increased people's belief in God. That's a little different. I mean, Harvard School is doing a research, and they're saying, okay, yes, there is System 1, Type 1 thinking, and System 2, Type 2 thinking. But you know, if we push Type 1 thinking and we get people grounded in Type 1 thinking, you know what that also does? It says show people who have a tendency to rely on their intuition are more likely to believe in God. Which is kind of fascinating, because within us, we have a double system. We have a System 1, System 2. And within us, we have intuition. And we can use it or we can lose it. And we can prefer System 2 or whatever, which would be more analytical. But they're saying here, the people that depend on intuition, System 1 type of thinking, are more apt to be believers, to believe in God. Another article, in an article published in Science in 2012, Will Jervis and Ara Norenzayan of the University of British Columbia found that encouraging people to think analytically reduced their tendency to believe in God. So we can manipulate what people believe by focusing on one system or the other, in that we are getting people to think a certain way. That certain way has consequences. In where System 1 is open to intuition, it's open to other sources of reliable knowledge, which then opens them up to a belief in God. System 2 is very intentional. It's reason-driven. It is the reasonable source. And human reason generally does not believe in God because you cannot prove it through logic. You cannot prove it through just a empirical sense, human sense. So in other words, the type of system that we are initiated in or that we are perfected in is the type of system that governs what we end up believing in and how we end up believing. And yet we have both those systems within us, but yet if one system is overdeveloped over the other, or one system is given preference most of the time, then we will default towards believing in that direction. So encouraging people to think analytically reduce their tendency to believe in God. And I don't think that thinking analytically is the reason for not believing in God. But I think that implementing that system, being a system based on human reason, leaves God out of our thinking processes, because we tend to depend upon the Western mindset, system 2, which is upon analytically thinking and only depending upon human reason. We've heard of these terms before. I had, but I didn't understand all their history of what they were involved. The mythos and the logos. Those are two things. When they say the mythos, I would say, yeah, I've heard of myths and mythology, but logos, have you heard of logos? And you might think of, yeah, maybe. Well, actually, the logos is a very big part of our science terminology, because we have studies that are in biology, in geology, in whatever ology you want, that is logos. And so the base of our studies is the logos within bio, within life. The logos within geo, which is the earth, the physical studies. What about the mythos? Where does that come from, and what does it mean? Well, the mythos and logos are two ancient Greek words that describe different ways of acquiring knowledge. Okay. So mythos is a method of acquiring knowledge, and logos is another method of acquiring knowledge. And how do those methods work? Well, mythos is based on storytelling and folk knowledge in an open system. Mythos. So mythos is a telling of a story that reflects beliefs, that generates a cohesion within a cultural setting. So a mythos is based on telling that story through storytelling, through folk knowledge in an open system. Folk knowledge, well, that would mean knowledge from an authority, or knowledge from culture, or knowledge from tradition, knowledge from... So in other words, to communicate knowledge through folklore was using the mythos system. While logos is based on logic and rational analysis in a closed system. So mythos and logos. Mythos in the beginning did not mean myth, meaning unreal, meaning fake, meaning something that was generated and made up and never happened. But mythos means telling a story, means generating knowledge, means passing knowledge on through intuition, through authority, through stories. Whereas logos is passing on information based on logic and rational analysis within a closed system. Those are two ways within the ancient Greek culture of communicating knowledge. But then years later, there was a movement. In Greece, there was a movement described as a move from mythos to logos, where mythos signifies now the supernatural stories people tell, the rational, logical, and scientific stories they tell. Okay, while logos signifies. So let me read this again. In Greece, there was a movement described as a move from mythos to logos, where mythos signifies the supernatural stories people tell, while logos signifies the rational, logical, and scientific stories they tell. So mythos and logos. And eventually the mythos was driven out of general acceptable ways of generating knowledge or passing on knowledge, and logos took its place. So logos became known as logic, as human reasoning, which came to mean the only source of reliable knowledge. Where mythos, which is connected to intuition, it's connected to authority, it's connected to tradition, it's connected to, was relegated to a second-class option of saying that it is not worthy of reliable knowledge. It's not reliable. Why isn't it reliable? Well, it's because it talks about the supernatural, and it talks about things that are not acceptable within critical thinking. Okay, so we have system 1, we have system 2, we have mythos, we have logos. It is a particularity of Western culture to observe the world from a dichotomy. That means from two. Split it into two pieces. So we observe the world from a dichotomy, and that was Western philosophy. Western philosophy invented the idea of categories and of division, of dividing, of separating. And so dichotomy means separation into two. That separates taxonomically the idea of nature from the one of culture. So in other words, you can study the natural world, but you can't get culture involved in it because culture contaminates the objectivity of the study of the natural world. But here it's saying it separates taxonomically the idea of nature from the one of culture, as well as the notion of natural from supernatural, the sacred from the profane, etc., etc., etc. So they're saying this is a particularity of Western thought, Western culture. Western is to observe the world from a dichotomy of taking it apart. And see, that is what the other educators were talking about in their non-Western culture, is preserving the harmony, preserving the unity, preserving the, and it's kind of like what deconstructivism does is it introduces disharmony, introduces discord, introduces things that don't go together. And it's kind of like these others are saying we don't want that in our culture. Our culture is based on harmony. Our culture is based on unity. Our culture is based on external authority. So it says it is a particularity of Western culture to observe the world from a dichotomy that separates taxonomically the idea of nature from the one of culture, as well as the notion of natural from the supernatural, the sacred from the profane. Critical thinking is strongly linked to type 2 thinking because it involves conscious, deliberate, effortful processes that analyze information, evaluate arguments, and form well-reasoned judgments. That is by Jean-Francois Bonnefon. He says, and he has made the connection, he says critical thinking is strongly linked to type 2 thinking because it involves conscious, deliberate, effortful processes that analyze information, evaluate arguments, and form well-reasoned judgments. So just looking at, we've gone over a couple different contrasts in a good Western way, making a dichotomy and separation. Let's just follow it down the chart a little bit. Can type 1 thinking versus type 2 thinking, number 1, be related to mythos versus logos? In other words, is mythos the original way to communicate type 1 thinking, whereas logos is the way of communicating type 2 thinking, reasoning? Number 2, can type 1 versus type 2 thinking be related to the left brain, right brain type of identifications that have been made, that certain people, left-handed or right-handed, or our left brain does this and right brain does that? Is that maybe part of the system 1, system 2, or different systems that interwoven through our brain? Number 3, can type 1 versus type 2 thinking, number 3, be related to a visual processor versus an auditory processor? So in other words, if your dominant mode of processing is visual, does that mean your dominant mode of system thinking is probably system 1? And if your dominant mode of auditory processing, then probably is not your dominant mode of system thinking type 2. Can type 1 versus type 2 thinking, number 4, be related to being a sight reader versus a phonetic reader? May the different types of reading actually correspond to the strength of the system that we employ more? So in other words, maybe type 1 thinking system is really developed and based upon sight, visual processing, and sight reading, versus type 2 thinking and processing be actually using auditory processing mode to establish and refine that type of thinking. Can type 1 versus type 2 thinking, number 5, be related to non-Western versus Western cultural tendencies? It's just a thought, but what that would mean is that we are all equally equipped, but our cultures have cultivated different preferences for different system types of thinking, type 1 or type 2. A published research in the US in 2009 reports that student skills in critical thinking and analysis have declined, while their visual skills have improved. Okay, if you look at the context of this report, 2009, and the growing of technology within the culture, in that what used to be a culture based on auditory sense input, the technological advances have pushed the tendency towards visual processing, which means that we tend to look at computer screens, TV screens, cell phone screens. And what that is doing is sharpening our visual processing mode, but at the same time it's diminishing our auditory processing mode because we're not maintaining them in equilibrium. And so what has that done, or what is that doing? A published report in the US in 2009 reports that the student skills in critical thinking and analysis have declined. Okay, why? Technology, probably, or our culture, cultivating how we communicate information, communicating how we process information, where do we go for information, while their visual skills have improved. I believe that that is the tension between underachievement and overachievement, between System 1, System 2, between sight reading, phonetic reading, between what preference we give to a certain mode of processing is what enables us to process differently, because we have different systems. Critical thinking skills are aimed at System 2 thinking, which requires auditory processing, which if our culture is adopting a more visual mode of digesting information or of investigating information or of reliable knowledge, then that is going to develop a visual processing mode, which corresponds more to System 1 thinking, which would then say critical thinking skills have declined because critical thinking skills are based on analysis, analytical, which is taking apart, which in visual processing, taking things apart analytically is not easy to do in a visual format. You can't take things apart as you can in an auditory format, where you got bits and pieces of information which can be disassembled and reassembled into a different product very easily. And I think that is why it's hard to listen to lectures. It's harder to look at information, to read books and make summaries, when that all requires analysis and reductionism. It requires taking things apart and putting them together and summarizing them, where those activities, cognitive activities, are built into and designed for a System 2 thought processing, which is based on, again, auditory processors. Socrates, his method of questioning all sources of knowledge led his students to question all authority, from the pantheon of gods to the local authorities themselves. So in other words, Socrates made a paradigm shift. Socrates introduced something into his own culture that was foreign to his culture, and he began cultivating a different pattern, a different way of thinking. That brings us to critical thinking and deconstructivism. Deconstructivism is linked to critical thinking because it is a mode of taking things apart, of analyzing things. But the danger of deconstructivism is that it leaves us without any belief. It leaves us without any hope in anything. It leaves us depending upon human reason as the only source of reliable knowledge. But yet, when we deconstruct things, we generally don't get them put back together. So students are left with the tools to deconstruct, take things apart, but to critically think, you must have content, you must have knowledge to be able to critically think on. So it's kind of a vicious downward spiral that has taken critical thinking, and it's part of deconstructivism that takes us down and down, but has not equipped us to build up in a positive fashion. Again, just showing these two quotes. We started with The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee, where he says the first philosophers were making two great breaks with the past simultaneously. In the first place, they were trying to understand the world by the use of their reason without appealing to religion or revelation or authority or tradition. That is Socrates. I'm going to move out of the way on this one so that we can read it. Read what was this gentleman's newer rendition, or this academic advisor that says, what is critical thinking doing to us today? And he says, after you strip away all the high-minded rhetoric, critical thinking is typically used to tell students that they should not trust conventional wisdom, tradition, religion, parents, and all that irrelevant, old-fashioned stuff. So if you compare the two quotes left on the right, how each one of them end, and how the original thinkers in the Greek philosophy were making a break from the past by using their reason without appealing to religion, revelation, authority, or tradition. And that's what this academic professor says today, is that critical thinking is typically used to tell students they should not trust conventional wisdom, tradition, religion, parents, and all that irrelevant stuff. So in other words, it's almost identical. It's what Socrates introduced to do is being reintroduced or is being reinforced to do in our educational system today, which is to eliminate other sources of reliable knowledge and just focus on human reason. But yet human reason, as we've seen in other episodes, does not take us to reliable knowledge that endures. Human reason gives us knowledge that is true knowledge for anywhere in the medical field from 17 months to 2 years. And in the engineering field up to 5 years. And so it's like, why have we chosen human reasoning when we know it is so limited, dated, and has a half-life of just a few years? We need more than that to hang on to. We need more. We need something from an external authority that we can trust and that we know that has been there from the beginning and will be there to the end, and that never changes. That is the source of reliable knowledge that we need, and that I think I prefer. So again, this quote from Dr. Ong from Burma, he says, "We have a culture of harmony, which brings with it a demand for respect and obedience. When children start asking questions, there may be a feeling that they are becoming impolite and aggressive. We need to teach," he says, "from a culturally sensitive position," which means respecting those other cultures, respecting what other cultures believe is worth learning and worth knowing and worth keeping as reliable knowledge. Socrates, his method modeled the following dispositions: a rational thinker, open-minded, analytical, self-confident, inquisitive, questioning the status quo, questioning of authority, and suspicious of any claims of knowledge. Okay, I think there's better foundations to build on. I think that if we are really after reliable knowledge, then we need to go outside of ourselves to find it, and we need to trust in an outside authority that is trustworthy and that has shown himself to be trustworthy. And that is what it's going to be in chapter 13. But here, winding up with this quote again by Stephen Jay Gould. First, facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture. And I would add spirits, the spirit world. The spirit world, as we have seen, has had great influence upon the development of modern science, modern thinking, and modern rationalism, and the scientific method. So I think we need to include that factor to not be blindsided, to not be blinded to all the different factors, theory, habit, prejudice, culture, and spirits that influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. This is session 5, wrapping up session 5 of chapter 10. Thank you again for accompanying me. We're Tim and Holly. You're welcome to communicate with us, to us through the following addresses that are on the board. Thank you again.